She swept the marble as if keeping time, with the flat palm of the broom, with a patience that measured days. The sound was regular under her hands, a soft, hollow tick that matched the rhythm of the building's heartbeat. Lamps hummed faintly overhead. The marble reflected a pale, cool light. Victoria James Okoro liked that sound. It made order of disorder. It held a city's small pry at quiet things. On her cart, beside polish and a thermos of black tea, sat a wooden box no bigger than a loaf. It was worn at the corners. The varnish had thinned where her thumb found it in the dark. She kept it with the same care she gave the broom's bristles: routine, reverence, a practice of returning things to their place. The box smelled faintly of cedar and old perfume, the scent of her mother's drawer mixed with lemon oil. Inside were three things: a folded gold dress whose silk had been pressed into a crease by time, a ring that fit her finger like an old promise, and a photograph of a young man with a wide, weathered smile, Henry Okoro in his prime. When she let the lid rest open, she let memory breathe. Henry had been a private man with a public laugh. People on the street remembered him for the fruit stalls he favored, the way he paid for a child's schooling out of the blue, the quiet ways he would slide an extra note into a widow's palm. In the corporate portraits, he was still and formal, a man who could sign a check with a single stroke. Victoria had known him differently, less of the suit, more of the kitchen, of suya and stories, of a hand that tasted of smoke and tea. He had called her once, on a morning when rain was loud on the corrugated roofs, to ask if she would sit and drink with him. They had sat on a stoop and watched the rain cut silver over the city. He gave her a small piece of advice, wrapped in a joke. "Sweep where you can, child. Sweep what is yours." When he died, his name became a currency. The foundation that bore his name magnified itself into gala dinners and plaques and speeches. It hosted inaugurals and cameras and chairs that made people lean forward in the kind of attention money buys. Richard Okoro, son to that legacy, a narrow man who had inherited the ease with which people misread his certainty, had taken the foundation and polished its shine until it blinded. Victoria's broom passed through the same marble that reflected Richard's chandeliers. She moved through corridors where the leather soles of the elite stepped like punctuation. She cleaned after dinners she would never attend, swept crumbs that had divided inside plates on which other people had not noticed their hunger. She had been content, more or less, in that small economy of labor and privacy. There was dignity in the routine, the kettle, the way tea was served to a tired security guard at dusk, the careful folding and refolding of the gold dress, the moments when she smoothed the dressing-room mirror with a corner of her apron and found herself reflected in a long, honest face. But the world has a way of slipping invitations into places the weary do not expect to look. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. It was thick, the paper heavy enough to make a small sound when it landed on the handles of her trolley. The envelope carried the foundation's embossed crest, 2 interlocking hands, and a card that had been printed with the kind of care that turned names into announcements. Guest of honor, Victoria James Okoro, family of Henry Okoro. Her name was set under the words in a type that suggested ceremony. The card smelled faintly of jasmine, as if the printing room had been perfumed to remind you of other rooms, gardens, stages, cameras angled like birds. Victoria read it twice. The broom rested on its bristles against the cart, as if listening. Her first thought was practical. Someone must have made a mistake. Perhaps an assistant had read the list wrong. She set the card down on the wooden box and smoothed the photograph with the heel of her hand until the picture flickered like a living thing.
In the photograph, Henry's eyes held a private malice, the kind of softness people who don't live public lives hold. He looked like a man who could say small things that would later prove to be large. Amanda was the first person she told. Amanda had been a cleaner too, until an opportunity at the foundation, a small promotion as a logistics assistant, had moved her into a chair where she managed cloaks and napkins and the anxious trimming of guest lists. Amanda laughed at first, the sound bright, not unkind. Then she saw how Victoria held the card, how her knuckles tightened around the edges. "You should go," Amanda said. She had been practical about it, folding her hands as if they could smooth any complications away. "They named you, V. That's not small, that's a door." Doors had never been Victoria's trade. She was more of a threshold person, someone who kept them moving and kept watch when they were closed. But she remembered Henry's advice about sweeping, and she thought, briefly, of stepping across one. The box felt warm where it sat on the cart. They argued in the kitchen of Victoria's small apartment in the rear of a row of low buildings that smelled of oil and pepper. The apartment had been rent-controlled for decades. It had a sink with a stubborn leak and a window that caught the afternoon light like a blessing. Victoria set the dress on the bed and smoothed the fabric with hands that had mended shirts and frayed hems for years. It shone under the light, a quiet star. "It's not about the dress," she said, because she knew what people would think, that she had climbed onto a stage for vanity. Amanda leaned on the doorway, a plate of plantain in one hand. "It's never about the dress," she agreed. "It's about being seen." They had coffee. Amanda offered pragmatic details. Travel, the best route to avoid cameras, which shoes would hide weary feet, and which would announce the presence of blisters. But between the list of logistics, there were smaller reasons. Amanda remembered times when Victoria had held a child's hand across a crosswalk because an adult could not be spared. She remembered her sitting by an elderly man in a ward because his family would not come. "You take care of people in ways they don't thank you for," Amanda said. "Maybe this is a place to get the thanks into the wrong hands." Her eyes were steady. She did not say the words aloud, revenge, but she nodded as if to the idea that justice might dress up in a gold gown. That afternoon, Victoria opened the box in public. It felt like airing a private room. The dress lay folded, its silk catching light like a secret. She lifted the ring. It was a narrow band, plain, but it had the peculiar warm weight of a thing that had been carried from one life into another and back again. She slid it onto her finger. The photograph watched her, unblinking. She decided to go. It was not a heroic decision. There was no speech or sudden uproar. It felt instead like cleaning a window you have avoided because the grime is familiar. She made a list. Call Amanda to confirm the route. Choose shoes that would not betray miles. Pack the gold dress into a tote with a spare scarf. She ironed the collar of a plain shirt until it held a small crispness, and folded the dress over it, pressing the silk like a letter closed and sealed. She tied the box's lid with a hair ribbon, because she had none of the padded velvet cases people at galas used. The ribbon made a knot that could be undone by fingers that knew how to do such things. When she told her neighbor, Amaka, a woman who sold phone cards and similes at a counter that took the morning's light and returned it in change, Amaka cried softly. The woman who delivered milk, the boy who carried parcels, a sister who embroidered, each had a small way of touching the news and letting it round the shape of awe. "Do not be small," Amaka said. It was not a command so much as an instruction for how to breathe. Victoria's fear was not the kind that makes the heart a hammer. It was an old, patient thing that comes from knowing what small humiliations can do over time, the way a joke at a neighborhood function can calcify into a reputation. She imagined the faces that would be in the room, people who had cheered the foundation into existence, and people who had given money because they liked the idea of appearing charitable. She imagined Richard's face, sharply angled as ever, the small, careful smile that was like a scalpel. She imagined the kindly hosts who would clasp her hands and say, "How brave you are," in tones edged with disbelief.
She imagined how a man like Richard would find a comedy in making someone like her an ornament, calling her up to the stage to the sound of soft laughter. Yet the invitation had not been an accident. Someone had written her name with intention. Someone had found a reason to call her family. That fact weighed against the landscape of small humiliations, and it swung the balance. "If this story feels familiar," Amanda said, because the two of them understood audiences and how they waited for predictable arcs, stay with it to the end. It was a quiet line, and it was a contract between them. Short, practical. She reached forward and squeezed Victoria's hand, a small gesture that anchored the decision. They arrived at the foundation in a taxi that hummed and then stopped under the portico. Outside, the night smelled of heated pavement and perfume. A row of valet attendants folded like a marine guard, and the red carpet lay long and patient. Lights flooded the building's facade like daylight bent into spectacle. There were cameras, always cameras, clustered near the entrance, their lenses like patient beetles. Amanda walked just a step behind Victoria, hands steady, a coat pulled close against the cool. A security guard who had known Victoria's work for years, someone who had watched her sweep corridors and pair lost gloves, recognized her and gave a small nod that carried a private approval. That nod mattered more than any applause in the rooms ahead. Inside, the hall had the hush of a place that expected money and delivered ceremony. Chandeliers looped their arms overhead, each drop of crystal refracting other people's faces. The sound that made Victoria's hand steady, the broom's soft tick, felt far away, like something she had left in another country. There were floral arrangements that smelled of things she had smelled only at funerals and coronations, jasmine and gardenia, the extravagant white of people who thought color was vulgar. People drifted in gowns and suits, laughter threaded with the clink of glasses. Richard appeared on the dais like a man stepping into his suit. There was a small, surgical applause. He smiled in the way of someone who had rehearsed other people's gratitude. He had asked for this evening to be curated. He had asked for the list of speakers to include voices that would underscore his father's legacy, while remaining, crucially, his. He had asked his MC to tell a story, light, familial anecdotes about Henry's humility to remind the room of the good name. He had approved the band, the menu, the seating chart, down to the placement of an old benefactor near the center. It was control held tight as if a slip might expose the seams. Richard had reasons no one quite said aloud. There was the ambition that had always ridden him, a need to be the visible axis of whatever his father had begun. There was the quiet decision to make sure the foundation was no longer associated with shadows that might hint of mismanagement. There were also subtler careers. The small resentments of having been criticized for not speaking enough with the public. The fear that his stewardship might be incomplete without a fresh narrative. He liked to think of himself as decisive. When a decision, like the evening script, offered the possibility of a joke, the kind that showed power was both owner and patron, he took it. He planned the joke with the clinical courtesy of a man who considered life a design. The MC would tell a story of domestic connection, of hands that had once kept the marble clean, of the way Henry's life had been tetrahedral: family, philanthropy, industry, and loyalty. Then, to close the circuit, he would ask that family to the stage. It would charm the room. It would remind supporters of their place in a lineage. It was, he told himself, a kindness, a nod that the foundation reached down to lift people up. He did not imagine that the gesture would be read as humiliation. He imagined it as a spectacle of benevolence. In his mind, it was a photograph, taken from the right angle. Richard smiling, a table set at his discretion, Victoria called as a tender joke, and rising with dignified surprise. He had not rehearsed for a stubbornness that is not spectacle but stamina. Backstage, the staff whispered of the plan as if gossiping about a costume change. Some thought it charming, some thought it unnecessary, and some thought it cruel but inevitable. They had seen the ways power likes to remind the world who feeds its vaunted hunger.
Helen, who had once been close enough to Richard that people assumed marriage, and close enough in the organization that rings of influence moved her like tides, watched the rehearsals with a hand folded over her mouth. There were lines she did not want to cross, but had already crossed too often. She was not without softness. She was not unknowing. Her complicity had been small increments, the omission here, the choice of phrasing there. Tonight she would assist in a toast, and when she rehearsed the words, they felt dry and made of paper. There were other preparations, quieter. Diana Musa, a journalist who had made a career of noticing the spaces where money met modesty and not always closing the loop, sat at a table near the back, a press pass hanging from her neck. She watched the guest lists and marked faces she knew from previous pieces, names of people whose giving had been episodic, whose testimony had sometimes wandered from the truth. Dr. Hassan, the Foundation's medical advisor, came and went in a discreet way, nodding to selected staff. He had a note in his hand, and a look he did not post on social networks, the look of a man who carries small, destabilizing truths. For reasons not yet shared, he had a recording on a device deep in his pocket. He would not hand it over that night, but it pulsed in the background like an insistence. Victoria took her place at the edge of the hall where guests were ushered to the seating area. She could have turned and left then. The sound of the band laid down a cushion of horns and strings that made the room feel like a living mouth. People looked at her as if she were a performance. A child, a guest of a patron, pointed in delight. An old man in a military jacket clapped his hands with slow approval, pleased that a story had found its live wire. Victoria adjusted the ring on her finger as if checking that it was still there. The wooden box sat in her bag like a sleeping animal. She felt the weight of it against her thigh, modest and heavy. Richard took the podium. His speech began with Henry's laugh and folded into the usual language of legacy, gifts, gratitude, the idea of stewardship. He spoke of the Foundation like a hand extended. The audience responded as expected, moral postures, nods, the polite applause of money that affirms itself. Victoria watched him speak and, in the sound of his voice, counted the small moments where tenderness could have been. He slid toward his anecdote with the cunning of someone who had mapped the evening to a calculus of approval. He introduced the moment with a casualness that had been practiced. Tonight, he said, we remember the foundations of our work in the people who taught us what it means to be generous. His voice was warm, decentered. He called it an honor to name someone who had been close to Henry. The MC leaned into it. There was a pause, a set piece. The guests shifted, the click of cameras rose like a tide. Would Victoria James Okoro please join me on stage, came the call. Silence deepened in the hall, as if the chandelier had pressed its own finger against noise. Heads turned. A spiral of conversation, small, surprised, opened like a flower at the question. The cameras nested nearer. Amanda's fingers tightened around the strap of Victoria's bag in a way that might have been panic if it had been unpracticed. Instead, it felt like a tether. Victoria stood because her feet knew other kinds of momentum. She walked past tables and flowers and the half-merciful glow of other people's curious eyes. Someone murmured a name that was not hers. The cleaner, a shorthand that thought itself clever. She heard the joke like wind through a cracked window, present and unremarkable. She felt it with the same patience she felt every other small blade of public exposure. She felt the flush that always visited when the world made her a toy, not humiliation as a cataclysm, but as accumulation, a slow, quiet attrition. On the stage, the lights were warm and a little too close. The audience could not see the tiny leak in the box's lid or the fold of the cloth inside. They saw skin and fabric and the invitation of spectacle. Richard's smile, trained and mild, grazed the room. He reached out, an orchestrated hand, and placed one upon the small of her back. If he intended to steer her like a prop for a photograph, he miscalculated the portion of human autonomy that cannot be staged. His hand could denote possession. It could not own a person's history. Victoria took the microphone with the same measured grace with which she had folded linens for years. The audience leaned as if listening for a punchline. The air tightened, thick as honey. For a moment she thought of the broom, of the way its bristles had softened where her hand passed day after day. She thought of Henry's hands and the small advice about sweeping. She thought of the wooden box and the weight of the ring on her finger. Her breath was steady. She kept her eyes sweeping the room like a practiced guardian, seeing faces, noting expressions, measuring how a crowd might be redirected. She smiled, but not in the way they expected. It was an economy of gesture, a concession to the ritual of exposure. "I come from the house of that man," she said. The sentence was plain. It was also staff and steel. She did not say, "He hired me," or "I loved him," or any of the softer lines the room might have leaned into. She claimed the name without apology. A sound moved through the hall then, an intake like a held breath realized. The cameras blinked, a small hush settled. Richard's smile altered in an instant. It was not an ugly change. It was a recalibration, a man adjusting a suit that did not fit as he remembered. Faces in the crowd did not yet know whether to laugh or lean forward. The expectation of the joke had been interrupted by an ownership they did not expect. Victoria lifted the wooden box from her bag with hands that had mended and had been mended by life. She rested it on the podium as if making a surface for truth. For a single second, the box was just a box. It smelled faintly of cedar. It bore the softened edges of a thing that had been handled lovingly. Then she untied the ribbon. She untied the ribbon as if undoing a small restraint. The knot came apart with a tiny sigh of thread. The crowd leaned forward as if the loosened ribbon had been the hinge on more than cloth. Victoria unfolded the silk slowly, so that the movement itself read as argument. Something intimate pulled into the light. The dress shook like a slow breath. For a moment the gold caught the stage lights and splashed warmth across faces that were used to being warmed by other people's money. Then she spoke, but not to the room only. She spoke to the few people who had carried other truths into the night. "There is more," she said, and her voice moved through the hall the way a broom's bristle finds a corner. Insistent, exact. She set the dress aside and reached into the bag again, producing a narrow envelope the color of old paper. It had a seal and a single line of Henry's handwriting across the front, a hand she could read as easily as her own palm. It said simply, "For Victoria." There was, in that small motion, a rearrangement of expectation. Cameras angled toward the envelope like birds toward a seed. Richard, who had been composed like an actor waiting for a cue, tightened the muscles around his jaw. He gave no small involuntary sound. Instead, he executed the polite pause of the man who assumes his authority can steady any surprise. Diana Musa rose from her seat with the purposeful air of someone who keeps records the way others keep promises. She moved to the side of the stage where projection equipment sat like a set of quiet witnesses. There was, in the way she handled the remote, a reluctance to make spectacle of private things. Still, the room had already tilted in a new direction. She pressed a button. On the wall behind them, a page bloomed into view. Henry's handwriting, the careful loops of an older man who had been used to signing papers for causes he believed in. The audience, so practiced at applause, managed instead a kind of silence that acknowledged the suddenness of being asked to reckon. The page was a codicil, an addition to the ledger of Henry's intentions, dated in the year before he had grown quieter. It named beneficiaries and trustees in phrasing that did not agree with the Foundation's public statements. It named people who were not in Richard's rotation of favors. It named, in explicit terms, the creation of a trust for community clinics and an apprenticeship fund managed by those who worked in the house Henry kept.
A hand went to Richard's microphone as if to cut the image from the wall. He did not speak, because the projection had done what arguments sometimes cannot. It brought ink into the same room as presence. The codicil was not a dramatic flourish. It was a legal fact made visible. There were pages to follow, receipts of payments redirected, a ledger in a hand that matched Henry's, letters that had been archived in a solicitor's office and now surfaced in Diana's careful journalist's hands. There was sound then, thin and simple, a voice on a recording Diana cued. The hall held it as people hold breath before a plunge. The voice was not Henry's. It was not a booming accusation or an arranged confession. It was the ordinary hum of conversation recorded in a place where someone had not expected to be overheard. The recording contained phrases that were enough. The mention of alterations to reports, suggestions that words be softened, the casual exchange about clearing things up so the foundation's image would be clean and saleable. It did not invent malevolence. It revealed management as a set of edits and omissions. It placed decision beside its consequence. The room shifted. People who had been leaning back now leaned forward, and those who had been smiling grew still. Richard's face, in the time it took a man to reckon a new map of public opinion, lost its practiced layer of geniality. He felt the ground change under a foot that had been used to steady marble floors. He reached at once for a defense and found his gestures turning brittle. Dr. Hassan did not stand up to be heroized. He walked to the edge of the stage with a small, surrendering step. He was a man who had looked at charts and vital signs and then, sometime, had been asked a question that peeled away a corner of his restraint. Did he sign? Had he attested to a report that suggested incapacity? The answer sat in his face before words could craft it. He took the microphone with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the sudden necessity of being plain. "I signed," he said. "I signed things I should not have. I was told it was for the family's privacy, for the good of the foundation. At the time, I believed them. I did not look closely enough." He did not make elaborate excuses. He described pressure in small human measures, late-night calls, polite insistence, the weight of someone's need camouflaged as urgency. "I was wrong," he said, and in the auditorium there was a silence that weighed like a verdict. Helen, who had sat with the rest of the benefactors and had smiled the smile of a woman who knew how to make her absence feel like a presence, stood abruptly. It was a small private motion, and then became public. She walked to the aisles and mounted the stage in a way that made the distance between complicity and acknowledgement visible. Her face was not a mask of penitent contrition. It was the honest, complicated one that comes from having made choices one can no longer unmake. "I did not tell the truth," she said simply. "I omitted things. I thought I was helping steady a house. I thought I was keeping family and the institution whole." She did not ask for absolution. She asked only for the truth of her actions to be placed on the table. "I am sorry." The confession did not end the story. It opened a seam. There were murmurs, but the murmurs had lost their earlier lightness. The cameras kept clicking. Their sound did not sound triumphant. It sounded like the noise people make while moving furniture after a leak. Richard rose then, and for a moment his arrogance took the shape of a man attempting to repair the window he had broken. He spoke in carefully chosen words about mistakes, about miscommunication, about his father's wishes being misunderstood. He promised cooperation. His voice, smooth in earlier rehearsals, now clattered against documentary evidence. Lawyers moved in the wings, as practical choreography did what accusations could not. They converted the evening into procedure. A request for an immediate meeting with the board was made. A list of actions to secure files and records was drawn up, and a lawyer's calm voice began to frame what would be public channels: hearings, oversight, formal inquiries. The room required an anchor. Victoria did not take the microphone again. She lowered the wooden box into her lap and felt wood against palm, the same palm that had wielded a broom all her adult life.
She stepped down from the stage when it was clear things would not be contained to the glitter of chandeliers.
Outside, under a sky that had lost its red light glamour, the cab ride home felt like re-entering a body after a fever. She held the box on her knees as if it were the map of a city she had been making alone for years. Amanda sat beside her and said little. She had always been the hand that smoothed complications. She now folded her hands differently, as if to hold possibilities. They did not celebrate. There was no triumphant speech at midnight, no gilded toast. The moment in the hall was a pivot, not a crescendo. In the weeks that followed, things moved with the former speed of institutionality. Statements were drafted, press releases circulated, the board convened. There were demands for resignations, petitions, and the sort of moral calculus that happens when private actions reach public scale. Days were filled with telephone calls that smelled of lemon oil and late-night meetings over tea. Amina arrived on the third day with a folder and a simple, strategic calm. She had the sort of steadiness that turned outrage into building plans. She sat at Victoria's small kitchen table with the wooden box between them like a lodestar, and they moved from what had been exposed to what could be done. "You could close this down," Amanda said, practical and blunt. "You could let them pay fines and move on, and no one remembers. Or you could turn this moment into the lever it already is. You could force a structure that keeps Henry's named intentions alive." Victoria felt the tug of a simpler desire, to take what had been taken and return it as punishment. The idea sat in her like an unmade bed. She had swept past such urges and always found them unsatisfying. There was, besides, the practicalness of her nature. Henry's advice about sweeping had always been a metaphor in her head: clean what you can. She looked at Amina and Amanda, and then at the worn varnish of the wooden box. "I want repair," she said, "not to break him more than he already is broke." Her hand closed around the ring, as if to steady the sentence. Amina nodded. "We can file for oversight and insist on a restoration plan," she said. "We draft a petition that includes trustees from the communities Henry cared for, people who know how to run clinics, run apprenticeships, track scholarships. We make it transparent. We ask for community seats at the table." She placed a sheet of paper in front of Victoria that had at the top the words "Restorative Mandate." Under it, phrases that felt like tools: Community Oversight Board, Independent Audits, Immediate Funds for Clinic Pilots, Apprenticeship Stipends, Emergency Microloans. There were lines for signatures, there were proposed dates for hearings. "It's not about punishing one man," Amina added, with a lawyer's clarity that was not devoid of moral tone. "It's about binding the institution to the purpose Henry named in his own hand." Victoria read until the letters blurred into the steady tick of obligation. The reconfiguration of the foundation was not seamless. Donors withdrew when the headlines grew harsh. Some took their names off plaques. But new supporters arrived: neighbors, small business owners, nurses who had once worked in clinics and now volunteered to run pilot programs. There were grant proposals that read like spreadsheets and also like promises. Money for a mobile clinic, stipends for apprentices in carpentry and sewing, scholarships for children in neighborhoods Henry used to visit unannounced. The work moved forward with a mix of austerity and imagination. Victoria threw herself into detail and delegation in equal measure. She understood how institutions failed when decision-making lived in single rooms with single people. She insisted on community seats for oversight and monthly transparency reports available for public reading in local libraries. She hired a program director who had run a mid-size clinic and insisted that the first budgets funded basic wages rather than publicity. Amanda coordinated logistics with the ease of someone who had once managed mislaid capes and cloakrooms. Helen, nervous and careful, took charge of volunteer coordination, learning how to make apologies matter as commitments. There were nights when Victoria lay awake counting things other than money. She wondered whether a modest clinic could heal more than $1 million gala. She wondered whether the people who had been first to call her the cleaner would ever see their error.
She worried about petty resentments that might slowly calcify into new exclusions. She worried about whether the human habit of returning to spectacle would compromise the slow work of mending systems. At those times, she would take the wooden box from its place beside her bed and rub a thumb along the worn grain as if feeling for a seam. The clinic pilot opened in a converted community hall. It was painted in colors that did not pretend to be neutral. Children had helped choose the palette. There was a woman at the intake desk who had once been a cleaner at a different building. She now worked with a modest monthly salary and a proud, fierce competence. The first patient to walk in was a man with a small cough and a giant debt to a pharmacy he could not afford. He left with a treatment plan, a small supply of medicine, and, perhaps more importantly, the knowledge of a follow-up appointment that would be kept with a reminder call rather than a postcard that might be lost. The staff recorded the day in a ledger that smelled of printer ink and possibility. They cheered as if for a good sweep. Another day, in an apprenticeship workshop newly set up in the Foundation's renovated annex, a woman named Nkechi counted the small notes of a first microloan, money she had been given to buy a sewing machine. Her fingers shook as she tallied payments and materials.
It was not a tidy moment in a single act of triumph. It was more akin to watching seeds push thin, stubborn stems through soil. She paid back her first small installment and then came back with a skirt sewn with careful seams and a pattern that had the imagination of someone who had waited too long to stitch into being. Victoria attended a ribbon cutting for a scholarship program that bore Henry's name. Children in crisp uniforms stood in rows, parents took pictures with phones and folded hands into pockets. A mural went up on a school wall, painted by teenagers who had once walked past the same corridor where Victoria had kept her cart. They painted hands reaching across one another, the palette of a community pooled in oranges and blues, a promise that the Foundation would not be a distant chandelier, but a neighborhood lantern. The public hearings continued. They were less theatrical than they were grindingly necessary. Richard gave testimony that sounded like admissions and apologies in measured doses. Witnesses corroborated the documents Diana had published. Some parts of the process took months. There was no dramatic final gavel. There were, instead, oversight mandates and an insistence that the Foundation's funds be audited by an independent third party. There were constraints placed on certain spending categories, and the Foundation's board was reconstituted with community representatives, people who balanced ledger sheets as a means of protecting daily life rather than polishing reputations. Richard, pushed from his perch, found himself looking for other uses of time. He did not become a cartoon villain. He became a man who had to reckon with a lack of audience, the way some men are forced to notice their own hands when no longer applauded. He agreed to step down from executive duties and continue as a trustee in a limited capacity under the new oversight until formal conclusions could be drawn. He appeared at some events, awkward and apologetic, doing the things public ritual demands. Ribbon cuts, brief speeches that thanked people with the collateral of his name. He showed up at a clinic opening and, for reasons that were not simple, sometimes brought sandwiches to volunteers. He did not resume the old pattern of authority, and there was a slow, complicated shift in him, a rearrangement rather than a demolition. People asked Victoria more than once if she felt satisfied. Satisfaction, she had learned, felt like a commodity she did not deserve to own in quantity. She felt instead a kind of sustained exhaustion layered over a sharper sense of purpose. There were good days where results multiplied in small, tangible increments. A nurse's salary cleared on time, a child's attendance improved because of a scholarship. An apprentice finished a stool that became a piece sold at the Foundation's small market table. And there were days when audits revealed errors, when old loyalties strained, when donors requested anonymity rather than accountability. Victoria learned to hold both kinds of news with the same evenness. The wooden box stayed close by, sometimes on her desk when the days were long, sometimes in her bag when she went into neighborhoods to visit clinics. Not everyone trusted the new arrangements immediately. There were nights when protesters gathered at the foundation's steps, some calling for more aggressive punishment, others mistrustful of any change that sounded like the old machine learning new clothes. Victoria stood before a small crowd once and spoke without the polish of a speechwriter. "Repair is not a moment," she said. "It is the long patience of work. It is making sure the person who fixes the roof is paid, and the child who needs a uniform receives one without waiting months. We will make mistakes, we will correct them, but we will do the labor." In private, she sometimes allowed herself the small indulgence of thinking of Henry on that stoop where they once sat and watched rain. She imagined him pleased that the notion of sweeping had been literalized into a series of acts that kept people's lives tidy in the best sense: untangling debt, mending health, making sure trade skills could sustain a family. She had no illusions that the work would be quick. She had instead a tidy argument with herself each night, that dignity accrues not by spectacle but by steady provision. Amanda married a partner from the logistics office who had always admired her brisk competence. The wedding was small and informal. Victoria was asked to bring a pot of stew. It was a domestic joy that kept her in touch with the ordinary. Helen visited sometimes with tea and quiet updates. They had conversations that did not pretend the past away. They sat together and sorted volunteer schedules, and the quiet neighborly companionship deepened into the kind of work that is slower to write about than to live. There were moments of public recognition that felt oddly modest: a small plaque given to volunteers, a newspaper that wrote not about scandal but about the clinic's first 1,000 patients. Diana wrote a long piece that tracked not the fall of a man but the reorientation of a foundation. She emphasized how community oversight had changed spending priorities. Her reporting did not seek praise for itself. It sought to name the people who had been quietly doing the mending. Her tone honored the work and refused to turn it into a fairy tale. Months folded into one another. The Foundation's annual report, once a glossy catalog of names and events, now included detailed accounts of clinic outcomes, apprenticeship completion rates, and a list of names of people who had been hired from the neighborhoods Henry used to walk. The board meetings now began with a reading of intention: "Why We Exist," named in Henry's ink. They read lines about clinics, apprenticeships, and the need to keep the work accountable to those it served. Those words were again and again the North Star. Under it all, Victoria kept small rituals. She swept before meetings as a way of centering herself, literal cleaning as a prayer of preparation. She measured the ring on her finger each morning and sometimes caught herself tracing the photograph in the box. On nights when the press cycle screamed with demand and the Foundation's inbox filled with unsolicited opinions, she would sit with the wooden box and feel the weight of choices. It had been a tool of memory. It had become, now, a measure of how rights could be returned. The hearings wound their way through procedural landscapes. There were months when nothing seemed decided, and the strain of public attention left deep ruts in the lives of staff. A minister at a local church spoke in support of transparency. A cadre of former donors argued for restraint. There was, behind the spectacle, a legal process that did what systems do. It took time. Yet the Foundation began to function differently regardless. Committees met in community centers rather than in private suites. Payrolls were adjusted to ensure living wages. Apprenticeships included certification and a path to market. The changes were not miraculous. They were accumulative. There were moments of friction. A well-meaning staff member misallocated a grant. An audit caught it. The mistake was corrected publicly with apology and repair. A funder withdrew in anger. A group of small donors responded by increasing their monthly contributions. People began to learn, slowly, that institutions bend to the habits they are trained to keep. Victoria trained them in a regimen of transparency and small acts of repair. The clinic that reports its patient outcomes. The scholarship that publishes its selection criteria. The apprenticeship program that validates skills with third-party certification. Each act required patience and bookkeeping, work that Victoria had always known.
Make a list, check it, repeat. One autumn morning, a young woman named Ijoma stepped into Victoria's office with a portfolio of designs. She had learned sewing in the apprenticeship and used the first microloan to buy a small stretch of fabric. Her skirts were honest and cleanly made. They had patterns that borrowed from neighborhood stories and the colors of market days. Victoria looked at her and remembered the first time she had seen a person count money and realize its power. Ijoma's business plan was modest but ambitious: to hire one apprentice within a year. Victoria signed off on a small seed grant. "Keep a ledger," she said, smiling in a way that held both affection and expectation. The seasons turned. The mural on the school wall that had once been a concept was now flaking slightly in places from weather, a small reminder of the maintenance required for any promise. Volunteers scheduled repainting days.
The Foundation's reports were no longer artifacts created for donors alone. They were posted in community halls and discussed at neighborhood meetings. Towards the end of the second year after the gala, a small festival celebrated the Foundation's work. Musicians from surrounding neighborhoods played. Children recited poems about school. Nurses cut a ribbon on a new mobile clinic. People came with food and laughter, and the old marble building that had once been the site of spectacle now opened its doors for a day of common good. Richard appeared, attended by fewer aides and with a smaller entourage. He watched as people he had once thought of as part of the backdrop took center roles. A nurse who had been promoted to clinic manager offered a short speech about continuity. A mechanic who taught apprentices announced a new partnership with local carpenters. Richard's face, at times, betrayed an expression that could be read as regret or as the discomfort of someone learning humility. Victoria stood a little back from the center of attention, a habit from a life spent at the margins. She let Amanda circulate and Helen coordinate volunteers. She wore a plain dress that had once hung folded in the wooden box and had since been altered into a garment suitable for work and the occasional photograph. A child tugged at her sleeve and asked whether the Foundation would teach him how to sew. She knelt down and showed him the seam allowance on a torn piece of fabric. He repeated the measurement like a catechism. She smiled, and the ring on her finger flashed in the sun. At the end of the festival, when the crowd thinned and the musicians packed their instruments, Victoria climbed the stair to her office. The wooden box, which had lived in a drawer for much of the year, felt warmer when she touched it. It had been opened and closed many times since the gala. It had been the repository of one history and then another. She set it on a shelf in her office, deliberately in view. She put the photograph on top for a moment and then slid it back into the box, because keeping a memory visible did not mean making it the only thing seen. Outside, late afternoon light slanted across the marble corridors. The sound of a broom began in the hallway, the steady, metrical sweep she had always known like a private hymn. She walked out into the corridor and paused. A young janitor was at work, his back bent not with the defeat of labor, but with the competence of someone who had learned a skill and now held it with pride. The rhythm of his brush met the tile like a metronome for a life set to order. Victoria stood for a moment longer, and then took the broom from his hand as if borrowing a moment of practice. She swept a stretch of marble and noticed tiny things: a smear on the baseboard, a small sticker that needed peeling, the evenness of color where hands had smoothed the stone. She did not do this to prove something to anyone. On an ordinary morning, years after the gala, no flags, no cameras, only the neighborhood's rumble, Victoria swept the front steps of the Foundation. Her movements were practiced and soft. The wooden box sat on a high shelf in her office, a box that had been the hinge of a public turning. The ring on her finger caught the sun as she bent to pick up a discarded flyer advertising a lecture, and she folded it before placing it in the recycling bin. The Foundation had become, slowly and imperfectly, the thing Henry had written for in that codicil, and the thing he had been in quiet life. A series of small acts that added up to a different culture.
The public humiliation intended for a woman who swept marble had become, instead, the point at which an institution was held to a standard it had previously merely advertised. Power had been redirected, not merely toppled, and the redirection had consequences. Clinics that kept shutters open, apprentices who found markets for their chairs, scholarships that meant one less night of worry for a parent. Victoria paused at the top of the steps and listened to the rhythm of the building. The low sound of a broom in the corridor, a child's laughter carried from a nearby park, the distant rattle of a vendor's cart. It was ordinary music. She allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that did not require a spotlight. She had been called to the stage to be made into an anecdote. Instead, she had made a movement out of a memory and a box. Inside her office, the wooden box rested where she could reach it if she needed to be reminded of what had started the change. A photograph, a ring, a dress folded between the pages of her life. She believed in the slow accrual of dignity, in the way a single steady hand at a broom could teach a city to keep itself from going to seed. She had no illusions about completeness. The hearings, the audits, the reconstituted board, these were processes, not endings. They required patience and vigilance and, above all, the quiet willingness to do the small, necessary things every day. She picked up the broom again. The sound it made on the marble was a hymn of her own making, unembellished, persistent, its rhythm the same as the city's steady work toward repair. If anyone asked where to start when faced with wrongs that seemed too large to touch, she would say, begin with what is near. Sweep your own steps. Make a list. Pay the nurse. Teach the apprentice. Keep the box on the shelf and let memory inform your choices, not consume them. If this story moved you, consider looking for ways to support organizations that prioritize repair over spectacle. Share what you learned, donate to local clinics or apprenticeships, or simply insist that institutions be accountable to the people they claim to serve. The work goes on in small, steady motions, and it is there that dignity is kept.